I want to welcome you to tonight's discussion about the issue of child safety in the context of Mormon worthiness interviews that bishops have with kids where they may discuss sexual subjects. Now, a few days ago, I asked people who have been having conversations about this issue online and in person to post some of the common objections that they've heard from believing members about the call that Bishop Sam Young has put out to have the leaders make changes to church policy so that bishop interviews are no longer one-on-one behind closed doors, and they no longer include conversation of sexual subject matter ever. And so they submitted a lot of those objections. And so my intention today was to go through and address each of these objections one by one, just try to see if we can come up with a good, solid response to that just out of the bat. But then something happened today in the news that I think gives us an opportunity to take a slightly different approach. And that something is this.
The grand jury uncovered credible evidence of sexual abuse against 301 predator priests. As shocking as that number is, the grand jury report notes that the jurors didn't automatically name every priest mentioned in the documents and the secret archives. They actually received files on more than 400 priests, but were careful not to name names if the information was too scanty to make a reasonable determination about what had happened. Over 1,000 child victims were identified by our investigation, though the grand jury notes that they believe that number was in the thousands. As the report reads, we should emphasize that while the list of priests is long, we don't think we got them all.
Okay, so it should be clear that the Catholic Church continues to struggle with sexual abuse of children by clergy. But I want to take you back in time to the early 1990s, where Sinead OConnor became notorious for tearing up a picture of the Pope on Saturday Night Live. And when she did that, she said, "Fight the real evil," or something to that effect. And in interviews around that time, she said what she was doing is she was protesting that the church was covering up rampant abuse of children by church clergy. And at that time, everyone was mad at Sinead OConnor for being so disrespectful to the Pope, and people did not understand the scope of the problem of abuse in the Catholic Church, and so they didn't think that there was anything to protest. They didn't think there was anything that needed to be changed. And so what I'd like you to do is to put yourself in the mindset of perhaps a Catholic Church member at that time, hearing about people wanting for there to be change, and then listening to the objections that are being raised at that time, because at that time people had no idea of the scope of abuse. They all trusted their priests. Priests were godly men. They were holy. They were, they gave all of the outward appearance of being good men of God, and they trusted their church. They trusted that the leaders would protect children. And certainly if there ever was a bad priest or somebody who did anything, then the church would make sure they were held accountable and wouldn't hide it, certainly wouldn't cover it up. That's the level of trust that they placed in their church. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the objections that were submitted, and instead of saying these are objections to changing Mormon church policy, we're going to see what it would look like if these were objections to Catholic Church policy, because people could have raised these very objections when protesters were trying to bring awareness to the issue of sexual abuse and saying that the Catholic Church needs to change its policy. Back then, priests met alone with children all the time, and their conversations could have included sexual subject matter, and because everyone trusted the priests, and there were no laws saying that should not happen, there were no guidelines, then people went along with it. And so let's see what it would look like to make those objections. So we're gonna change what we have now, certainly we understand now in Pennsylvania, they've uncovered a tremendous problem, and that's just in one geographic area. And so we're talking now, let's pretend we're talking about the Catholic Church, and let's just take each of these objections, re-articulate it from a Catholic perspective, and then see how you would respond to it now in the present day that we understand the scope of the problem of abuse in the Catholic Church. And then at the end, we're going to kind of take a look and see what are the differences between the Catholic Church and the Mormon Church. Because remember, we all understand that religious leaders in the Catholic Church are not perfect. They are subject to frailties, they're subject to temptation. And is that true of leaders in the Mormon Church? And I think the answer is yes. And the leaders even admit that. Dieter Uchtdorf famously said, I think it was in 2013, that leaders have made mistakes and leaders are not perfect. So if they're not perfect, then certainly in the Catholic Church, we would understand that means that you have to have policies that set very clear boundaries of both appropriate and inappropriate behavior. So it's very clear to everyone involved when somebody goes out of bounds. So let's take a look at these issues. All right, so we'll start out with the first one. Okay, this is the objection. You shouldn't try to change policy. The leaders are inspired by God to make policy, not the lay members. Now, you can imagine a Catholic could raise this objection. The Pope, the cardinals, the priests, the bishops, those are the ones who enact policy. Those are the ones who are concerned about policy. Lay members should not try to change God's church. And that's an argument that somebody could make, but clearly we've seen that the leaders of the church who were claiming to represent God were not doing what was necessary in order to protect children. Now, when you look at researchers who look at how sexual abuse occurs and is perpetuated in institutions, one of the things that is a problem is that there are no clear channels of reporting abuse that are not to an entity that has a stake in the organization, so that when you report abuse to the organization, they not only have to consider the abuse, but they also have to consider the reputation of the organization. And we've seen this, if you've paid attention to the Catholic Church abuse issue, when people reported things to the bishops, because of the fear of embarrassment of the Catholic Church, not wanting to lose the confidence of their members, they would move bishops around, they would hide the abuse, they would swear victims to silence about the abuse. And so it's clear in the Catholic Church that if members saw problems of abuse, I think as Mormons, we would say they are very justified in calling for changes to policy which would help protect children. Remember, even though a majority of priests are not abusers, and it's only a fraction of priests that end up being abusers. But even because of that, the policy still needs to exist because you're looking to protect the most vulnerable, protect the children from those instances of abuse. So I think that this objection would not fly. So let's go to the next one. Okay, so this person says that mostly members have diminished the issue, saying, I never experienced creepy questions. Now we're talking about those sexual questions that a religious leader might ask a youth. And in the Catholic Church, maybe that was in the context of confession or in one-on-one sessions for youth guidance. And if you've watched the movie Spotlight, you can hear dramatic recreations of victims talking about how they were groomed for abuse. And in some instances, that included the priest introducing sexual subjects into the conversation that served as a sort of grooming for their potential victims. And so for somebody in the Catholic Church to say, well, I was never abused, a priest never did anything inappropriate with me, so I don't think we need to have policies that protect children against priests, well, we can see that that's ludicrous, because even if it didn't happen to one Catholic member, it does not stop the reality that there are so many other victims of abuse. And so I think it's very reasonable for people to call for change, even though there are many, many people who never experienced abuse. That's good that those people didn't experience abuse, but these policies are to protect the vulnerable who may otherwise encounter a predator or have an untoward outcome because somebody takes an opportunity to abuse. All right, so let's go to the next one. We have standards. We need to reinforce them. It keeps us apart from the world. So I think Catholics would also say that they have standards. They believe themselves to be moral people who listen to their religious leaders, who read the Bible and adopt the moral standards of the Bible in their own lives. And if historically that included having discussions with their religious leaders that included sexual subjects in private, then they might defend it with this, saying, well, we need to be able to have our priests talk to children about morality, about masturbation, about these issues in private, in confession, because that's how we maintain our moral standards. And what that reflects is sort of it's almost a lack of imagination. It's like you can't imagine that you would still be able to teach moral standards without private one-on-one interviews. There's a video on the Facebook page and on the YouTube channel for Thoughts on Things and Stuff where there's a story of a young priest who was assigned to a Catholic school, I think it was in Canada, and he started having meetings with the children in the school, and the children went home and said, well, this priest asked me if I viewed pornography or masturbated. The parents were very alarmed to hear that a religious leader talked about that, called up the school, and the school by 1 o'clock that same day had fired the priest from his spot, because now that the knowledge about how abuse happens and the danger of allowing religious leaders to talk about sexual subjects behind closed door with kids, now that the Catholic Church has been confronted with that issue, they have a higher visibility, particularly when parents know about it, to make sure that there are very strict boundaries held. So I invite you to check out that video because it brings up a very important point. Now, when we think about a Catholic saying this, I think that we would be able to say that it's still possible to have standards. It's still possible to teach morals and to feel like you're set apart from the world because of those standards and morals, and do it without having private interviews discussing sexual subjects. You know, Bishop Sam Young is simply saying, let's end these interviews and let's end those interviews. Let's end the privacy of the interviews. They can still have interviews. There just needs to be more than one person. And let's end discussion of sexual subjects in the context of those interviews, whether or not there's another person. And that's something that is still possible. You can still teach about moral standards of behavior. Okay, so let's go to the next one. The church has already put safeguards in place. And I think this is where we're seeing in the Catholic Church, you know, somebody might say, if you've seen the movie Spotlight, it talks about the discovery of abuse in the Boston area. And that was in the 2000s, in the 2012, 2008, 2009 era. And the church was forced to respond when all of that became public. And it involved some religious leaders losing their posts. It involved making very clear policies that drew very clear boundaries, and then the church showing that it was committed to making those changes. And somebody might say, if people were still protesting, well, the church has already made the changes that they need. There's no reason to continue to bring visibility, to continue to embarrass the church by protesting these issues. But as we saw today, where there was documented proof of continuing ongoing abuse, then those, it's clear that still attention is needed in this area. So I think objections like this don't carry any weight. So let's keep going. All right, next objection. The bishop has powers and resources far beyond secular training. And I think this is an objection that happens when people like Sam Young say that the bishops are not trained to handle issues of human sexuality. They're not trained in how to respond to a child who's been the victim of abuse. They're not trained in how to actually speak about sexual subjects in a safe manner that accounts for the possibility that people in their audience may themselves be victims of sexual abuse, because you can actually do more harm if you do that in a very uninformed manner that doesn't take that into consideration. And there's this notion in Mormonism that bishops have the Spirit to guide them when they do things, and so they'll be guided into the right thing to say. And I think Catholics, because they also have an idea that their priesthood are a different, they're set apart in that they are representatives of God, or they are ordained to this higher calling, that they would also have that type of thing. And when you listen to documentaries, there's a series of BBC documentaries where they go and they talk to mothers and survivors of abuse. And what they universally say is that, we trusted these men because they were men of God. We thought that they knew the right way to approach children, to help wayward children. And it's just not the case. Even for people like priests that are dedicating their lives to religious service, they are not trained mental health, sexual health professionals who know how to deal with the complexities of abuse and how that affects a child's life, how it affects their perception of themselves and their interactions with others. So, we want, when we say no sexually explicit questions, part of that is protecting kids from well-intentioned but uninformed religious leaders, be they Catholic or Mormon. All right, so let's keep going. So next objection. They are judges in Zion, and because of the special keys that they hold and the mantle that was placed upon them, they can't do bad things. These stories are all too similar and made up. Okay, so this is, if a Catholic was to articulate this objection to calling for a change in the Catholic Church, they could say, well, our priests are men of God. They would never do these bad things. And it's clear that you can't rely on the fact that someone claims religious authority or has been put in a position of religious authority. You can't trust that to mean that there will be nobody who preys upon children. And that should inform you that you need to have policies and procedures which draw clear boundaries of appropriate behavior and inappropriate behavior. And in the Catholic Church for a long time, they didn't have those clear boundaries of, well, you should never be meeting one-on-one with a kid. And they didn't have the clear boundaries of, you should not be talking about sex in these, interviews with kids, because that is part of a grooming behavior. But when you make the change and you put those policies in place, then it changes the expectation of all of the participants, both the leaders as well as the members, so that if a member sees a leader starting to talk to them or having them in private sessions in a way that's contrary to how they've been informed policy is, then they can raise the red flag, they can remove themselves from that situation, and they don't have to feel like they're violating a leader or disrespecting God to do it. So you could see in the Catholic Church, that would be a very important thing to have in place. Now, on the issue of those stories are all too similar, and so they're made up. When you read researchers who have interviewed hundreds of sexual predators and abusers, they have found that many of them operate from a very similar script in terms of how they identify victims, how they groom victims, how they conduct their abuse, and then how they conceal their abuse and try to keep it secret. And so it really is no surprise that many of the stories do sound familiar. Now, one of the things that you'll find about predators is that they will use the architecture of an institution in order to conduct their abuse. And so what that means is they identify vulnerabilities in the culture, in the policies and procedures, and they exploit those vulnerabilities to gain access to their victims. And so a very obvious vulnerability in the Mormon Church as it exists now, and in the Catholic Church before news of all of these abuse scandals had, was the normalization that a religious man could meet in private, in secret, with a child. And that's a clear vulnerability, I think, for these Catholics. And so if you were to hear that a lot of the victims of abuse reported, yeah, the priest did such and such, took me into a private setting, and that's where some of the abuse happened. If you heard story after story that sounded very similar, because that's how their culture was, and those are the weaknesses that multiple predators would exploit, it would not be surprising to have them be similar. So the objection that stories are similar and so they're probably made up carries no weight. All right, so let's keep going. Okay, how else are you going to assess whether someone is worthy to enter the Lord's house? Now, is there a Catholic paradigm for this? I don't really know or think that there's really much in the way of a Catholic paradigm for this. Mormonism is special in that we have these temples that you have to pass a worthiness interview for. And this is something that people who look at this issue, particularly about the covert abuse, where the concept of unworthiness bringing that and placing that on the shoulder of a child that's trying to manage what it means to develop through the stages of puberty, wrestling with changes in their body and developing at the normal way that people do sexually at that age. When you demonize normal human sexual development and label someone or cause someone to label themselves as unworthy, including unworthy of the Spirit of God, because of those things, it creates all sorts of problems, as we've seen in other videos. So one way that many people have started to answer this question of how are you going to assess someone's worthiness to enter the house of the Lord is to consider a few things. Number one, is it the case now that nobody unworthy enters the temple? And the answer is no. We understand that nobody is perfect. So everybody who enters the temple has some measure of sin. Now, is sexual sin somehow special than any other sin? Well, we've heard that it's next to murder, but we've also heard that no unclean thing can enter the house of God, referring to heaven in the afterlife. And we've heard that, that any degree of sin is not good. So if you allow that people with any degree of sin are attending the temple now, then you're not changing anything by not putting a part of the bishop's interview that exposes children to the dangers that are inherent to allowing bishops to ask probing sexual questions. It's possible to adopt a paradigm where people understand that they have inherent worth as children of God, and that there is nothing that they would do that would cause God to see them as losing worth. And the empowering aspect of teaching children that no matter what mistakes they have made, no matter what paths they have traveled, they always have worth in the sight of God is actually a positive way to help children deal with the complexities that we all face in life, rather than carrying this bludgeon that you hit kids over the head with metaphorically about the fear of unworthiness for issues and complexities and mistakes and everything that we all have made, at that point in our life where, we make mistakes, we stumble. When a toddler is learning to walk, they always fall. If you were to take a toddler who falls, when we know all the toddlers fall, and pick them up and spank them because they simply fell while they were learning to walk, we would see that as abuse. And if that toddler then, started to grow a fear of walking or a fear of their caretaker, we could understand that. Well, this is the metaphor for what we're doing to children who are developing and learning how to deal with the complexities of adult life. All right, so let's keep going. So a bishop is a judge in Israel. At baptism, you take chastity vows and make covenants to obey them. Worthiness interviews are to be expected, especially priesthood, who are expected to be worthy to administer the emblems of the sacrament. So, in Catholicism, they have kind of a different approach, is my understanding, where they already accept that everybody falls short of perfection. There's nobody that's perfect. And so this may not really apply to them. Once you accept the idea that nobody's perfect and that we all have faults, then trying to label one person as worthy and another person as unworthy becomes problematic because, everybody has faults. And, even Dieter Uchtdorf said, you can't, judge somebody else because they sin in a different way than you do. And that's what declaring one person worthy and another person unworthy because of a particular answer to a question is doing exactly what Dieter Uchtdorf said we need to stop. And so, there's some conflicts in the way that the church approaches this issue. And while it's separate from the issue of keeping children safe, because we're only saying we need to stop the private interviews and stop explicit sexual questions in any of these interviews, the church can find ways to articulate a doctrine of Christ that still endorses moral behavior, that still allows people to aspire to find worth in themselves, worthiness before God, and deal with, fact that everybody falls short, and do so in a way that is consistent with a healthy Christian gospel message. It's just that we have fantastic theologians. We have spiritual men who have thought about these things. And I'm sure that, we've heard messages from Dieter Uchtdorf that could really fit in this paradigm and that could bring people peace. So it's sort of a lack of imagination to say that this couldn't work. And that one doesn't have much of a parallel in Catholicism, but let's look next. Okay, the church now allows a parent or another trusted adult to attend these interviews. I feel that my 3 daughters are protected. So, imagine that you're a Catholic and the Catholic Church said, some parents, if you want to, you can meet with anytime your child meets with the priest, you can be there. And that would be good for parents who are present, who are informed of this. But remember, the purpose of our policies is to create clear boundaries of behavior at any time and for all people. It's not to allow the default position to continue to perpetuate placing children who don't understand the dangers in a position where they could be alone one-on-one discussing sexual subjects with a priest. And so if that had persisted in the Catholic Church, there would still be a window for abuse to happen. And what we're trying to do is to close those windows for abuse. So I think you could respond to a Catholic that was trying to raise this objection by saying we need to have policies which protect all children at all times, not policies that are optional based on whether the child is informed enough about the dangers to ask for it. Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, so this never happened to me. We've already talked about this objection. Basically, policies are, while it may not have happened to you, we're trying to create policies that are protective for everyone because we want to cover those instances where vulnerable people would be put in harm's way. Okay. The leaders are inspired to make policies, so we shouldn't challenge them on one hand, and the leaders are not perfect. So you could imagine a Catholic saying, well, the bishops, the popes, the cardinals, they are inspired to make policies, so we should just trust them. There's no reason for you to protest or to call for change. And clearly, if anyone had raised that objection in the past decades, that is proven to be not the case because, the leaders are not perfect. And particularly if leaders have a dual obligation to try to keep the reputation of the institution nice and shiny and also deal with the sexual abuse stuff, we're seeing that institutions will tend to cover up abuse. They'll tend not to institute policies that reflect the realities of abuse, and that mixed obligation is problematic and they have to work to overcome it. So in the Catholic Church, that certainly means they need to start being proactive. They need to not minimize the degree of abuse, the realities of the abuse, and really have hard-hitting policies and consistent enforcement of those policies. Because leaders aren't perfect. So we as members, if we were Catholic, if we understood that, we would be justified in continuing to call for change until actual effective policies were put in place that, were matched by what sort of outcomes that we saw. All right, so let's keep going. All right, if you don't like it, then leave. So you can imagine in Catholicism, if people raise the objection, we're still allowing priests to meet one-on-one, we're still have policies that don't protect children, and then somebody would say, well, if you don't like the Catholic Church, then leave. Well, that misses the point. It may be that somebody feels very committed to the Catholic Church and they want their church to be a stellar example of how you safeguard children and how you help foster the spiritual development of people. And part of doing that is having safe, effective procedures to protect against abuse. So in the Mormon Church, certainly we could say the same thing. I've heard people tell me, well, people leave the church, but they can't leave it alone. You keep criticizing the church. You just need to go off and do your own thing. You've left it, leave it alone. Well, many of us still have family members. We still have nieces and nephews that are in the church, and we want the church to be as healthy as it can be because we see the effect of abuse. And, even if you leave, the children that are still there are still subject to the terrible outcomes that happen. So I think we would say Catholics, even people that left the Catholic Church or, were critical of how it's handled the sexual abuse, calling for changes to policy, they're still justified in doing that. And the idea that they need to leave would basically eliminate the very people who are sensitive to this issue who can actually push for change. All right, so let's see. What was that anti-Mormon thing you sent me about how bishop interviews are abuse. Okay, so this is more of like any time. This is, imagine in the Catholic context, if there was somebody who understood the issue of abuse and was calling for the Catholic Church to change their policy, and then a family member said, you're sharing things on Facebook that are anti-Catholic. Well, you could respond to that by saying, well, no, these aren't anti-Catholic. What they are just anti-abuse. We're against policies and procedures which place children in a vulnerable setting where they may be abused. And so we want the policies of the Catholic Church to be updated so that they reflect what we now understand you need to do as a minimum to protect children. And that may be background checks, that may be making sure that there are clear boundaries about what's right and what's wrong for leaders to follow. And I think somebody would be very justified in doing that. All right, this isn't the way. Okay, so this is a response, Sinead OConnor ripped up a picture of the Pope. Other survivors of abuse banded together. They formed an organization called SNAP, and they helped support each other, and they would protest Catholic churches. And you could imagine a Catholic member saying, well, this isn't how you're supposed to affect change. Well, if the change hasn't happened, we are so far into the 21st century where we've seen the effect of abuse. We've seen how it's perpetuated by predators. We understand a great deal of those dynamics to the extent where we know what types of policies and procedures can help mitigate, can help minimize the risk of abuse. And public schools have instituted it. Boy Scouts have instituted it. Government agencies have instituted it. So we've seen all of these institutions that don't have to protect a divine right start to institute these policies because their main obligation is the safety of their members. We need to start seeing churches do the same thing. And so far, we don't know the right way, because if the church hasn't actually achieved the level of safety, because we're still seeing these abuse stories come out, then any sort of protest, any sort of way that you can bring visibility to the issue is worth trying, so that people can actually have something that will eventually make a change. People say that Sam Young shouldn't be doing a hunger strike. I think there are even people who support Sam Young that are very worried that he will hurt himself as a result of this. He's done it. And so what can you do other than to try to make sure that the visibility of this issue is out there, because the church leaders have not responded. If you look at the responses that the Mormon church has made to this issue, they have been half measures that reflect that they don't really understand the nature of abuse and how you actually protect against it for everyone. So this isn't the way. What is the way? Because going through proper channels doesn't work when men think that they speak for God and members don't. All right, so that Sam Young has no morals and doesn't even believe in God. The harm achieved by these interviews outweighs the small number of cases of abuse. These people make me sick. Okay, so suppose there was somebody who became aware of the Catholic issue and was calling for a change in the Catholic Church to try to protect children. Would you assume that they have no morals? It may be that they actually have very strong convictions about the propriety of the types of interactions that religious leaders have with children, and they want to see clear boundaries set. That's a very moral position to have. And regardless, you can have atheists who will still want a church to have safe policies and procedures, because atheists understand that there will always be people who feel a call to religion and who respond to religion and find that of worth in their life, even if they don't share that value. And so it's still possible, and you see it all over, where even people who don't have a specific belief in God still think it's the right thing to do for churches to institute policies which are protective of children. And Sam Young has articulated over time that he struggled with doubt. He struggled with belief. We even have church leaders who have admitted that. And people, wherever they are in their life, can still find little islands of moral stands that they want to take. And I don't know where Sam stands in relation to God, but that does not matter. Just as in the Catholic Church, maybe there was a victim of abuse who lost all their faith in God, but still protests the way that the Catholic Church has handled abuse. And that protest is valid regardless of what the protester believes regarding God, because they're not protesting God, they're protesting these policies. All right. The change needs to come from within the church rather than external pressures by anti-Mormons. Well, let's look at how a Catholic would respond to this. You know, many of the people who were victims of abuse have left the Catholic Church, and they've felt unempowered to speak about their abuse because they felt the shame and the guilt and the self-loathing that goes along with all of that. And maybe later in their life, they're not a part of the Catholic Church, but they finally started to come to terms with the history of abuse. And part of their processing of that is realizing that they can, as part of their healing, try to make that environment safer for other children. And so they become activists in calling for a change in the Catholic Church. Well, the Catholic Church, we've already seen that they've hidden the issue, they've concealed it, they've silenced victims, they've, covered up and not reported their own clergy who they've learned have committed abuse. And so it's actually outside of the organization that any real change can come, because those are the people who are actually willing to allow the uncomfortable truths to be out in the air. The organization itself, because they're trying to protect their reputation, does not allow these uncomfortable truths to be out in the air that you have to understand in order to realize there's a need for change. So saying that, people who aren't Catholic shouldn't protest the Catholic Church's handling of abuse is clearly missing the point, and the same is true for Mormonism. All right. My mother said that 8-year-olds are not children. Okay, I don't, that is an argument that has no basis. There have been victims of sexual abuse at 8 years old in the bishop's office. And that was because a bishop was able to meet in private one-on-one with that child, and then was able to use their religious authority to do that. So that's the type of thing that these policies would be protective of in the Catholic Church or in the Mormon Church. All right, the church has already fixed it with their updated policy. We've already addressed the issue of, the church has already fixed it. No, it has not. The Catholic Church clearly has not, because they're still having these abuse issues, and the Mormon Church has not, because the changes to policy that they made have not actually told bishops what they can't do. It's permissive. It says bishops can do this, bishops should do this, but in no instance did it say a bishop shall not ever do such and such. And we're trying to get them to acknowledge that the way you have a safe policy to protect children everywhere is a bishop shall not meet one-on-one in private with the child. That is a boundary of what inappropriate behavior is. And right now the policy does not have that. Anytime it refers to something that bishops shouldn't do, it leaves it up to the bishop. So it says that bishops should not ask inappropriate probing questions, but it doesn't define what that is. And it allows bishops to consider themselves judges in Israel. So at any point they can say, well, I was inspired to ask this, because the guidelines don't have clear, unambiguous restrictions, then it's still permitted. All right, so why can't you just trust the brethren? Well, for Catholics, why can't they just trust their cardinals, the popes, the priests? Well, clearly it's because we see in the Catholic Church, none of those men are perfect. They're all subject to temptation. They're all subject to human frailties, which means that you need to have policies and procedures which are protective of the vulnerable that may interact with them. That's true in the Catholic Church. It's also true in the Mormon Church. Okay, tribal identity. And I think that's just an observation that, people in a particular in-group, the Catholic Church, don't want to see problems in their group. And so there's a bias where you assume that the leaders are doing the right thing, they're men of God, and so you don't want to recognize that there are problems. You don't want to talk about it. You don't want to acknowledge it. And what that does is it allows those problems to persist. And it's only when you step back and say, wait a second, it doesn't matter how I think of this organization, these things are wrong and they need to change, and you feel empowered to give voice to that truth, that's when change can happen. And it can happen from people outside of the organization or people inside of the organization. But all of these objections that we're seeing to Sam Young are part of that tribal identity, because people have identified anyone who criticizes the church and what it does as being part of the outgroup. They're apostate, they're anti. And so you don't want to listen to them. You don't want to agree with them to any extent, because you would feel that like that's betraying your identity as a member of the church. And what we're trying to break through is we're trying to say, no, that it doesn't. You can still love the church. You can still love the prophet, love the gospel, love your identity as a Mormon, and want for this to change, because these changes will actually make Mormonism healthier and safer, and they can be consistent with the gospel. We just need the brethren in charge to have the vision, the alertness of this issue, and the spiritual and theological creativity to find a way to make it work through inspiration, through revelation, however they want to contextualize bringing these changes about, they need to happen. Okay, so they already made the changes. We've talked about that one. As a judge in Israel, the bishop has spiritual gifts that help him in helping the youth draw closer to the Lord. It's still possible in Catholicism for people to say bishops are men of God. They know how to safeguard children and how to help develop them spiritually. You can still do that and have clear boundaries of appropriate and inappropriate behavior. You can still say that a Catholic leader has spiritual gifts, and those gifts have to operate within the boundaries set by what we've defined as appropriate behavior. In Mormonism, the same thing is true. You can still hold that a priesthood holder has something special that helps him know what to do, and do that in the context of clear boundaries where there are certain things that they should never do, that the Spirit would never condone. We already have this notion that Satan is the father of all lies, and so we have an idea that God would never bring his purposes about through the use of lies. So we already understand that there can be boundaries about what is appropriate in the way that God affects his purposes in the church. And we could extend that to, there's no reason that God and his representatives through the church, through the bishops, would have to engage in private sexual conversation with the child in order to bring about his purposes and foster the spiritual development of children. It's still possible to do that. We just have to have leaders who have the vision and the attuneness to this issue to be able to make it work and make it happen. Okay, here's a series of them. The movement is trying to stop all interviews, and we need those. Now, let's be very clear. The movement has 10 words, and that is no one-on-one interviews and no sexually explicit questions ever. We're not trying to eliminate interviews. We're trying to draw clear boundaries about how those interviews should take place. Now, in the Catholic Church, if we were to look at how someone would object to that, they could say, well, we're trying to, have bishops never interact with the youth. And again, that's not what you have to do. Organizations can still hold to the concepts that they have about leaders fostering healthy relationships with children. It's just that needs to be done in the context of very clear parameters of what appropriate and inappropriate behavior is. And you can do that. You just have to have these policies in place. This isn't a big problem, so any changes are unnecessary. Now, this may be referring to the idea that, the number of victims of abuse is actually a very small percentage. Well, if you take all of the scouts, it's actually a small percentage who are victims of abuse, but that doesn't change the fact that scouting needed to change its policy to close those vulnerabilities that were being exploited by sexual predators. The Catholic Church, the number of people who were abused by priests is a small fraction of the entire population of the Catholic Church, but that does not change the fact that the policies and procedures and what is considered to be acceptable and appropriate need to change to reflect an understanding of those vulnerabilities. Okay, so next one is Sam is trying to tell the leaders and God what to do. This is an objection where, you can't tell leaders what needs to be done. And if we allow the idea that leaders are not perfect, and we allow the idea that all of us, whether we are at a particular position in the church or not, need to be humble and teachable as the Spirit directs from wherever we get that information. And if we allow that, there have been even instances in our history, and the example that's frequently brought up is when Emma Smith asked Joseph Smith, isn't there something that can be done with all of the tobacco and issues? And from Emma Smith asking Joseph Smith, alerting him to a problem, he then turned to the Lord and found a solution, which came in the form of a revelation that we accept as the word of wisdom. So there's a context for members to bring problems and lay them at the feet of the leaders and say, we need a solution. What can we do about this? And that doesn't, and you can even say these are some potential solutions, but the other side of that is that the leader needs to act. And so, if we were to take this in the Catholic context, someone could say, well, you're trying to tell the Pope what to do. You're trying to tell the Cardinal what to do. Well, if their existing policies and procedures are putting children at risk and they're not changing them, someone needs to tell them what to do, because maybe God is telling them what to do and they're not listening. And maybe they'll start to listen when people start bringing it out into the open, and now social media, the news media coverage is happening. Maybe those are the things that need to happen in order for these men in authority to listen. And clearly that's happened somewhat in the Catholic Church. In the Mormon Church, Mormons accept the notion that there are prophets that are at the head of their church. But if you look in Scripture, there are examples where the prophets have not done the right thing at the right time, where they've fallen lax in their duty, and it took some calamity or some negative thing to happen for the prophets to be spurred to action, to realize that they were being, short in their duty. And that is what we're seeing now, because these policies, when you start to inform and educate yourself about the dangers inherent to the type of interactions that the church still allows, even with these policy updates, you can see that there still is change that needs to happen, and it's not coming. All right. Without worthiness interviews, the members will struggle even more. Well, there are members of other religions who don't have worthiness interviews, who don't have a lot of the negative outcomes of that, but still feel very much a conviction to their spiritual identity, to their relationship with God, and are still able to have healthy, fostering interactions with their pastors or with their religious leaders. The Catholic Church, as they started to draw some boundaries, and things like one-on-one confessionals with priests talking about sexual subjects are no longer allowed, they still are able to have relationships with their clergy. The idea that the Spirit is not going to continue to have a powerful effect in individuals' lives if they don't have worthiness interviews really reflects a lack of faith in the power of God, in the effectiveness of the Spirit, and in the ability of God to keep people safe and continue to foster their spiritual growth and development. I think these things are still possible. The interviews are supported by God because it's policy, so we shouldn't question it. So imagine a Catholic saying, well, the way that the priests interact with the children now, we've been doing it for hundreds of years. It's clearly God's organization. That's how God intended his spiritual leaders to deal with their members, even children. So we shouldn't question it. But clearly that's not a reasonable position, because we're seeing the effect of that, which is that all of this abuse continues to happen. And the same thing is true in Mormonism. In Mormonism, there's even a cultural context which empowers these changes to happen. And that is that we have this idea of ongoing, continuing revelation. So the leaders are given a ticket to make these types of changes and say this is part of the ongoing revelation. When we became alerted to these dangers, we were inspired to make these changes. And that's okay. People would accept them at their word to be able to do that, because what they're doing is helping keep children safe. They're acknowledging the realities of abuse and doing at least the bare minimum to actually protect children. All right. Don't question the leadership because they are called and led by God. You could imagine someone saying that around the Catholic abuse, and you could say, calling for changes of policy which protect children is something that needs to be done because we're seeing the effects of the policy. We're seeing victims come forward. We're seeing the level of abuse. Whether or not they're called and led by God is a separate question from having these policies in place, because once we've already acknowledged that that all men are imperfect, including the leaders, then it means that they may have instituted policies that do need to happen. And it shows the importance of having protective policies, because that means that there may be sexual predators called to those positions. All right. Why is this such an issue for you? Did something happen to you? This is something where some people object to people taking part in advocacy and activism if they themselves are not part of a particular group. Some people would say, well, you can't be an activist about child abuse unless you were abused yourself. And I think that when you look at the network of people in the Catholic issue who have called for changes, it can be people who were victims of abuse. It can be people who had family members or loved ones who are victims of abuse, or friends, or who simply found a story so heartbreaking and so tragic and saw that it reflected a shortcoming in an institution that they loved and wanted to see get better, their church, that it inspired them to take action and to become an activist for those things. And we would say that that's completely reasonable. I think questioning the motive of somebody who's trying to get changes made in a positive direction to protect children is missing the point. And this is something that people would levy against myself, which is that, well, you're very critical of the church a lot of the times. You're just making a big stink about this issue because you want to embarrass the church. And while I have been critical of the church in many of my videos and everything, I understand that the church is not going away. And I understand that I still have family members and loved ones that will remain in the church. And it's okay for me to want my nieces and nephews to be raised in a healthier environment in which they will be safeguarded from the types of predations that we're seeing are problematic in these types of institutions. So those arguments carry no weight. All right, bishops hold sacred positions and would not hurt anyone. Well, clearly in the Catholic Church that is not true, because we're seeing that many religious leaders have been abusers. And clearly in the Mormon Church this is also not true, because there have been scout leaders, there have been bishops, there have been counselors, there have been stake presidents who have, in their position, preyed upon and abused children. And that's if you look just at the overt abuse. When we look at the covert abuse, which is the psychological damage and emotional trauma that happens from demonizing normal human sexual development, making people feel unworthy before God, over sexual sin that you're saying is next to murder, that type of psychological and emotional abuse is even far more widespread. And people don't realize that they're engaging in it because they have been misinformed about the proper way to contextualize normal human sexual development, even within a moral spiritual framework of a religion. Okay, I was never asked inappropriate questions by bishops. Again, we've addressed this already. Just because it doesn't happen to you doesn't mean that it's not an important issue and that there aren't victims out there and that those stories tell you that there is a need for change. If members are or were abused, it's their trial from God, and the abused must have enough faith to overcome it, because the interviews are essential to God's plan. Now, in the Catholic Church, this would be like telling somebody who was abused by a priest, well, that's your special challenge for God, and we still have to allow these interactions to happen because that's God's plan. And you can see how terribly horrible that argument is, because it further reverses blame and places it upon the victim. It minimizes the trauma that they've experienced in their life as a result of this abuse. And on top of that, this argument has the effect of perpetuating abuse by causing people to close their eyes and close their minds to the dangers that exist because of the way that policies are not protective right now. So this is a terrible argument, and I feel horrible that people have made this argument. But anytime you see any of these arguments being made in your discussions, just realize these are arguments from positions of ignorance, because these people don't yet have an understanding of the nature of abuse, the dangers involved, because if they did, they would see how important it was for these changes to be made. And so I try not to approach it from a confrontational, aggressive perspective, and rather more of an educational perspective. Well, let's learn about the issue of abuse. Let's learn how it's happened in other institutions and what they've done to safeguard against it. And then let's see if there's a way that we can find a place in Mormonism for those same types of safeguards to be in place, and for the church to continue to fulfill its goal of fostering the spiritual development of children, because, they can do that. The church has made a lot of progress in acknowledging that there are many religious people of faith of many different sects who are good people, who are spiritually mature people, whose relationship with God is worthy of respect, and who themselves are moral good people. And so if the church is able to identify that people outside of Mormonism are good, moral people who were raised in organizations that did not allow these inappropriate interactions, then we know it's possible to foster good spiritual moral people without having those interactions. Okay, so bishops are being led by the Lord, so it's completely safe. Again, the record, both in Catholicism and Mormonism, shows that that is not something you can rely on. Shame is a big deal, not just in the church, but in society in general too. The good, bad, black, white, absolute thinking many have from being too orthodox can exacerbate the shame. I think that's not exactly a response to the question. Let's look to the next one. I feel that the hunger strike is just a cry for attention, and that's inappropriate. So I think a hunger strike is inherently a cry for an attention, but you have to see, is it attention to an individual for self-aggrandizement, or is it attention to an issue so that people can learn more about the issue, see how important it is, and start to internalize and understand the need for a change so that the overall social and mental and thought process and spiritual tide can start to move in the direction where we understand that these changes need to be made. And I think that it's, if somebody was going on a hunger strike to try to bring attention to how the Catholic Church still has dangerous policies which put children at risk, then we could say, well, they're probably very committed to getting those policies changed. They've probably been deeply hurt by those policies, and so they feel that it's worth even placing themselves at risk in order to see people become aware of the need for this change. Well, that's very true of Sam Young as well, and anybody else who has been willing to vocalize support for this change. 18-year-olds are not children. That's disingenuous. Okay, so this is a protest that really doesn't have a Catholic comparable way of stating it, but what it's reflecting is people that are trying to make the case of, well, we only do those interviews for missionaries, and missionaries are 18 and they're adults, so you guys are making a big deal out of nothing. And the reality is, anyone that's in the church, that's grown up in the church, understands that that is a false representation of the reality, and that is that kids are having interviews as young as 7 years old. I think for those kids younger than 12-year-olds, it's rarer for them to be explicit sexual interviews, but we do have stories of some bishops claiming that that's necessary. And it's mostly in the teenage years where you have bishops that are having interviews that include questions about the law of chastity, and that is an inherently sexual question because it's asking them about sexual things happening in their lives. But then follow-up discussion delves deeply into sexual issues. And we're seeing people with stories about that. And that's happening before 18. Okay, asking about the law of chastity isn't sexually explicit. And this is something where you have to step back and say, okay, if let's say that the Catholic Church had something they articulated as the law of chastity, and we saw that bishops in the Catholic Church were asking kids about this law of chastity, would we consider that to be a sexual question? Well, does the law of chastity deal with sex and sexual issues? Yes, it does. It is inherently about sex. All of the things that are violations of the law of chastity deal with sexual subjects. And so simply asking about the law of chastity is asking about the sexual life of a child. And I've compared it to try to bring a kind of a metaphor that grabs your attention, it's like a church leader peering into the underpants of a child to ask them this question about the law of chastity, because it's the bishop asking a child to open up the sexual aspect of their life to them. And when this is done in privacy, behind closed doors, with both the notion that the leader represents God and the idea that sexual sin is next to murder and that aspects of normal human sexual development constitute sexual sin, is just a terrible, terrible arrangement, and it's something that needs to change. It is sexually explicit. You cannot have a policy that allows church leaders to ask about the law of chastity, because there will always be follow-up questions. There will always be kids that either have violated that law or don't understand that law. And so that opens the door to further conversations, which always get sexually explicit. It is an inherently sexually explicit question. All right. And that is our last objection. Okay, so I don't want to extend this too much longer. I will go ahead and see if there are any comments. All right. Well, I'll just let you guys talk with yourselves. I don't have the ability to multitask enough to really address comments, but thanks for paying attention and watching. I hope this was helpful, maybe in your own discussions with other people where you're trying to educate them about the importance of this issue. When they come back at you with some of these objections, I'm just hoping that people have at least some way to start responding to those objections in a way that can continue to drive the conversation. In my own experience, I've talked with people where they were initially resistant to the change, but as we started to share stories and learn about this issue from the Catholic Church, from Boy Scouts and everything, gradually they came around on the issue. And I think that's the type of education and support we want to promote. All right, thanks.